Well, hello again, and welcome to Midweek Moments with St. John's Baptist Church of Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Dennis Faust, and I have the blessing and privilege of serving the people of St. John's as senior minister. We're using these midweek moments during the pandemic to try to keep in touch with one another between Sundays and our digital worship experiences that we share. But we're also trying to use this time to speak to concerns that we need to be attentive to in our living. And we are attentive, of course, to many things during times like these. One of the points to ponder right now is how have we as white churches, white Christians, white people been contributors to the systemic racism that we're experiencing. And so we're exploring together and learning how we can better understand ourselves and our friends and our neighbors and our communities, and how we can contribute to healing, to redemption and reconciliation, and to bringing about a more peaceful and a better world. So today I'm going to introduce to you part one of a conversation that I shared with Leslie Bragg. Leslie is a wife and a mother and a teacher of English and literature. She is a deacon in our church at St. John's of Charlotte, and an extremely caring and nurturing person, but very attentive to this subject about which we're speaking right now. I would just remind you that we are all of one race. Each and every one of us as humans are part of the human race. We are all alike, and we as humans are the ones who decide what we will proclaim as different about us. God has created us to be a unified people, to focus on unity, and we are the ones who tend to always be capable of majoring on our diversities. So what we want to pay attention to in today's conversation between Leslie and I is how do we begin to understand just by listening through the stories of others. A couple of things I'm asking us to tend to this summer as a community of faith. One of those is for us to renew ourselves and to learn more about the Beatitudes, which Jesus taught us. The other subject that I'm trying to ask us to pay attention to this summer is to read at least one, and hopefully all three, of the books that I'm recommending. These books are a little bit varied, but possibly you can find at least one of these that would be helpful to you. The first book that we're looking at is a book entitled Divided by Faith. This book is especially attentive to how evangelicals have been attentive to their own contributions to systemic racism. Now, I'm sure that the problem of race in America is more important to some of you than it is to others of you. And I am also fully aware, that many of you who will watch this do not consider yourselves to be evangelicals. However, my guess is you know some people who are evangelicals, or who claim that name, and you know individuals in your families, most likely, who would familiarize themselves with the evangelical tradition. So I would just ask you to read this book. It will help you understand yourself and some of your roots. It will also help you to understand some of your friends. Divided by Faith. A second book that I'm recommending that we read together this summer is entitled The Color of Compromise. The Color of Compromise. The truth about the American church's complicity in racism. It is an excellent writing by a graduate of Notre Dame, and is helpful to us as we try to explore together. Today, the conversation that I'm introducing between Leslie and I is around the third book, The Sun Does Shine. It's by Anthony Ray Hinton, and the subtitle of this book is How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. Ray lived on death row in Alabama for 30 years. He had an alibi. He should have never been arrested. He should have never been questioned, much less arrested and sentenced. His punishment was completely ignored by all of the systems in the state. And once he was released, he has a sweet spirit and a wonderful story, tragic story nonetheless, but it's a story that we need to learn about because it helps us understand how not only does he live his life, but how many black men have to wake up every morning wondering how their day will end. So today I introduce to you this conversation between Leslie Bragg and myself around the book, The Sun Does Shine. Hey, Leslie, and thanks again for being willing to have this conversation about a book, The Sun Does Shine, that has made an impact on your life. And then you gave the book to me. It was so impactful for you, and I'm appreciative of the gift, but the book as well. So,
absolutely. Thank you.
So I want us just to have a conversation today about this book and a variety of issues that surface for us in our journey about the book.
Great.
So your ministry in daily life, in addition to being a wife and a mother, is what?
I am a teacher, and I do feel like it's a ministry and a calling. I teach 11th grade English, and I'm drawn to that age group and fortunate to work with them because they have this great ability to think critically and to try to start owning their own opinions and perspective. And they're also full of potential and about to make their mark on the world. So in addition to teaching content, I've always additionally thought that I have a responsibility to model, and I know that I'm teaching outside of my content area because of the way that I treat them, that they'll see that my goal is that I treat everyone the exact same, and that I'm forever respectful, that I make mistakes in front of them. And so I feel like I'm teaching so many other soft things in addition to our content. So because of all that is why I define it as a ministry and a calling.
Well, and we've had this conversation, but the reality is there are a lot of people who are teachers of content, and then some of those folks become educators. You know, education means leading or drawing out of a person the potential. So if you're involved in education, you're focused on the person,
right,
and not just on the content.
Right. Yes.
And so you are an educator.
I love that. I strive to be.
You are, yeah. Well, I know for several years you've used literature, as you mentioned, to guide them, and I'm intrigued as to the way you use literature in helping the students think about difficult conversations, difficult topics. Could you talk a little bit about how you do that and other examples in addition to this? But
right. So I'll go through and maybe end on this. I try to create units of study that are open to interpretation and that are centered on big questions. So one of the units of study that is always really intense and engaging is we do a war unit. And we focus on different wars in the periphery, but it's based on the Vietnam War and a book written by a Vietnam veteran. And it allows us to engage in so many levels because what does it mean to go to war? I partner with the history teacher across the hall, and he's educating them on what led to the Vietnam War. And a lot of that was lack of truth or lack of understanding communism and the threat of communism. But we also look at the human angle through the literature and what does it mean to ask someone to fight for their country, and in that war particularly, and then how do you treat veterans who return, and how should you treat soldiers for doing what you ask them to do. So, and we also look at the fatalities of that war. I believe there were 58,000, and the majority of those were 18 years old, and my students are about, so there's just I think every unit that I design, I try to create a lot of different entry points for complex, difficult, critical conversations.
Thank you. And so one of the books that you used for several years was To Kill a Mockingbird,
Yes.
to help the students talk about some significant issues. First of all, I'd just like for you to talk a little bit about why did you choose to use To Kill a Mockingbird, and what were some of the subjects and the conversations you can remember that emerged out of using that book?
Right. To Kill a Mockingbird is on my top 10 list of favorite books ever, and it's on a lot of people's top 10 list.
It's on mine.
It's such beautiful writing, but more than that, the characters that Harper Lee created, and the character of Atticus Finch is such a compelling man who will, in this case, stand against the members of his polite society to do what is right. And some of his quotes, I think, are still used all the time, that you never know another person till you walk in their shoes or spend some time in their skin. The fact that she told that story through the eyes of a child who innocently becomes aware of the prejudices and racism of her society. It's an incredible, valuable book, and I loved teaching it.
Yeah.
But I don't teach it anymore.
And that's critical, and I'm glad that our folks listening and watching this can hear you explain the impact this book made on you, and what would make you shift from To Kill a Mockingbird to The Sun Does Shine. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I read The Sun Does Shine in 2018, and when I put it down, I started wrestling with the fact that I thought I needed to replace To Kill a Mockingbird, which, I mean, truly, it wasn't a snap decision.
Yeah.
But the reason that I felt like I needed to do it was that Harper Lee very accurately reflected the 1930s, the setting of To Kill a Mockingbird. And in that, to be frank, the white people rescue the black people. The black people are in need of rescue, and they are powerless in that book. And that reality is an important one to acknowledge, but I feel like, I began to feel like it just was not the message that I wanted my student. I didn't want to reinforce that singular vision. On the contrary, The Sun Does Shine is about a man, a black man who is wrongfully convicted of a double murder. He has an alibi for the night of the murder. So there's no question of his innocence. And he is fortunate to meet Brian Stevenson, a black lawyer, and there is not a white savior in this book. Mm-hmm. And it just became very important to me for us to look at similar issues with an updated lens.
And in fact, in the book, in his story, there are several white manipulators, even after he is in prison, who step in as if they were going to be his savior and then are anything except that.
Right. Yes. Right. There. It's a complex look at race and the reality of Ray Hinton's story is that he does not find relief or help or adequate legal representation from the white attorneys, but he does from this the brilliant Bryan Stevenson.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, there are many, as we've talked, there are many profound thoughts in the book, but one that made an impact on me, and I know did on you, I want to just read it. It's in the foreword, so it comes very early. We need to think about the fact that we are all more than the worst thing we have done.
Such powerful words from Bryan Stevenson, who, through his work in Alabama at the Equal Justice Initiative, which he founded, he has come to the realization that he does not agree with the death penalty because of that fact. And I've heard him speak, and another compelling thing that he says is that it's not, the question that we should ask is not, do people deserve to die for the worst thing they've done? It's, do we deserve to kill? When 1 out of every 9 inmates on death row has been proven innocent statistically. So with that rate of error, do we deserve to deliver the death penalty? And one thing that makes me think of with regard to teaching is that when we have conversations about this book and that issue in my class, we listen to everyone's viewpoint, and there is no obligation for us to reach consensus. In fact, I very much encourage a space where we will respectfully hear different opinions, because I think that that's a life skill. That's an important one.
I agree. And I think it's one of those life skills that the church must teach.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we have in our society moved to a point, because of our polarization, to the point that we've completely forgotten how to have difficult conversations or to listen to understand one another. And we try to speak so much to try to get the other person to agree with us, rather than just saying, well, what words do you use, and how did you come to those words, and how did you reach that perspective, and so forth. So I'm glad that's being taught. May it be taught to all children and adults in this time.
Well, you actually remind me of one of the compelling things about Hinton's story is that while he's on death row, he actually creates a book club, which the English teacher loves. But he also befriends a man named Henry, who he later realizes is on death row because he was convicted of the last lynching was it in Alabama?
It was.
And he's a member of the KKK. And Hinton is stunned by the news, but refuses to write Henry Hayes out of his life, and instead his ministry in life is that he is able to forgive and able to have important conversations, and he models beautifully Christ-like approach to others. And in fact, Hayes, we've talked about this, says that he was wrong for those beliefs because Hinton didn't preach those beliefs to him. It was the way he lived his life. It wasn't so much as Hinton arguing and refusing to listen. They actually engaged in conversation about that, and Hayes ultimately came to a more Christ-like way of life.
As I remember, Hayes was the son of the Grand Master of the KKK, and at one point says to Ray Hinton, "My dad taught me to hate you people, and he was wrong. My dad was wrong." And there's just a sense in so many ways. And when Henry Hayes' father dies, there's this tradition in the South, of course, of people taking food. And Hinton tells the story that night of how all the prisoners on death row sent their coffee and any kind of food they had down the cells, handing it from bar to bar, between the bars, to get it down to Henry Hayes so that he could know that that community was coming to him. The ways in which we're all getting invited to the table is it's communion is what it is.
Absolutely. And that community was largely made up of African Americans or Black men who were comforting their friend.
Yes. Yeah. I thank you for paying attention to part 1. Next week, we will continue the conversation for another 10 to 15 minutes and introduce you to some other stories from within this wonderful book. Well, again, I trust that you will be on this journey with us this summer. I ask you to remember that when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, he was not just talking about an important story for us as Christians to internalize about compassion or care. His original audience who heard that story, that was a racism story. So let us pay attention to the fact that we are following Jesus, the author, the finisher, the Lord of our faith. And he taught that we should live as anti-racists, expressing compassion. Shalom.